Well, the upcoming execution of a man convicted in the shooting death of a Houston police officer has created a sort of diplomatic standoff between the U.S. and Mexico. That's because 46-year-old Edgar Tamayo is a Mexican national. Now, Mexican authorities and a former Texas governor are appealing to Governor Kerry for a temporary stay to hold off on his execution. In 2004, the International Court of Justice said that the U.S. had to review the execution sentences of 51 Mexicans in a decision known as the Avena Judgment. A statement by the Mexican Foreign Affairs Ministry reads in part, quote, "Should Edgar Tamayo be executed without the review of the criminal proceedings and a reconsideration of his sentence in accordance with the ICJ ruling, this would be the third time a Mexican included in the Avena Judgment has been executed, a clear violation by the United States of its international obligations under the Vienna Convention." Secretary of State John Kerry has also asked for a temporary reprieve from execution. In a statement he released back in September, Kerry said, quote, "I have no reason to doubt the facts of Mr. Tamayo's conviction, and as a former prosecutor, I have no sympathy for anyone who would murder a police officer." But he warned that this man's execution could have impact on how Americans in legal trouble are treated abroad. Tamayo was found guilty of the 1994 death of Officer Guy Gaddis outside of a local nightclub. An appeal hearing to consider the clemency happened today in U.S. District Court for the Western District of Texas in Austin. Tamayo's execution is scheduled for tomorrow. To discuss the details of this case and the international repercussions of an execution, I was joined earlier by Richard Dieter. He's the executive director of the Death Penalty Information Center. And he started off by talking about today's appeal hearing.
I don't think the judge has made a ruling, but will be making it prior to the execution. Obviously, this is a challenge to the clemency process in Texas, which has been upheld in the past.
Now, I know that you are against the death penalty, but this case goes beyond whether you are for or against capital punishment. It's not arguing over whether or not this man is in fact guilty of this crime. This is about an international diplomacy issue. Can you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Sure. I mean, I think the chief concern is that U.S. citizens who travel abroad may get arrested, or their children may get arrested, want to consult with their U.S. embassy very quickly. And the treaty that protects that is the same treaty that's implicated in Tamayo's case. He, being a Mexican citizen, had the right to consult with his embassy or his consulate when he was arrested, and that right wasn't given to him. So all that's being asked for is a hearing. Just let's see, would that have changed things? And so far that hearing hasn't happened. So there certainly is more at stake here than simply for or against the death penalty.
So what exactly is the Vienna Convention of Consular Relations? What would it have helped?
Well, first of all, it's a bilateral kind of treaty. Both countries sign it to mutually respect it. And the U.S. back in the 1960s signed and ratified this treaty. So there's no question about our adoption of it. And we even said that the International Court of Justice shall be the arbiter of this treaty. And so a case was brought before there, and the U.S. was found in violation. And still, these kinds of hearings haven't happened. So now there's legislation in our Congress to try to rectify this, to try to get Texas to do what the treaty requires, but that legislation hasn't been passed yet.
Now, in a recent LA Times article, you said that Mexico usually intervenes in capital punishment cases before the trial actually happens. But that didn't happen in Edgar Tamayo's case. Why is that, and what difference would it have made if they had intervened before the trial?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a series of events. When the first Mexican national faced execution, this whole issue dawned on governments and dawned on Mexico that, you know, what could they do to stop it? And at the late 11th hour, it's very difficult to stop the train of execution. So about 10 years ago, Mexico decided to try to stop these before they go to trial, avoid the death penalty. Tamayo's case goes back 20 years ago. So, you know, there was no Mexican program at that time. What difference it would have made? Well, I mean, at a trial, you want to present the person's family history, and that family history is over in Mexico. The people, the culture, the language, the mental institutions, if there were any, all of that is hard to get for a Texas lawyer. But for a Mexican embassy, they can go right to it. And that kind of evidence could have been presented to the jury. And if only one juror had said life, Tamayo would not get the death penalty.
Now, does this come down to something as simple as the Miranda rights, where there's just a statement that they read, that they prepare, and that's it?
That's exactly right. It's one more line to the Miranda rights, and the U.S. State Department has issued cards to police officers around the country with that language in various sub-languages, so that you could read it to a citizen who, a foreign citizen who doesn't understand English. But few police have used those. Few courts have demanded that they be used. Miranda rights is protected under the U.S. Constitution. This doesn't have that full weight.
Now, back in 2008, President Bush had appealed against the execution of another Mexican national who was, in fact, a part of that World Court ruling, asking them to reconsider this. However, then Texas Solicitor General Ted Cruz convinced the Supreme Court that the state does not have to adhere to World Court rulings. Why is that, and what type of a precedent does that set for the future?
Yeah, that's a dangerous precedent, I think. You have to remember, too, that President Bush was, before that, Governor Bush of Texas. So here's President Bush ordering Texas courts to review this. And as you said, the issue was brought up to the Supreme Court. And what the court said was that there needs to be legislation saying how the treaty should be used, how it should be applied in Texas. And just because the U.S. signed and ratified it doesn't mean that Texas has to follow it. They do as the law of the land, but only through Congress's implementation. And there's a bill, Senator Leahy of Vermont has introduced the Vienna Convention Compliance Act to get this. But until Congress acts, Texas feels they are protected, and in a sense, under the law, they are. So they're not saying we flaunt all of this,
right,
but there needs to be legislation.
Well, as you mentioned, this is the last few hours before this man's scheduled execution. There are a number of others that are on trial, so potentially not affecting this man, but maybe in the future. Richard Dieter, the Executive Director of the Death Penalty Information Center, thank you so much.
Thank you.